So hi everyone, it is wonderful to see you. Just to note, we are recording and with Professor Yeboah's permission, we'll be able to share with the UCR community. Hold on, I'm admitting more people from the waiting room. Okay, great. So my name is Crystal Moonhead Peck. I'm an associate professor in gender and sexuality studies here at UC Riverside. I want to thank everyone for coming to our talk today titled Everything But the Stage, Toward a Feminist Oral History Performance Praxis with Professor Nikki Yeboah. So I'm going to introduce Professor Yeboah in a second. Hold on, I'm going to admit more people from the waiting room. So first, I want to thank the Center for Ideas in Society here at UC Riverside, especially Catherine Henshaw and Kathy Ann Hitchens, just for all of their logistical support. I know originally we really wanted this to be an in-person sort of campus visit, and unfortunately it didn't happen, but I'm also really glad that all of us have this opportunity to participate in ways that feel safe to everyone. I also want to thank the CIS research clusters, Blackness Unbound, as well as Performing Difference, just for all of their support for this event, especially Professor Donatella Galella, who is actually co-facilitating and supporting this event as well, who really continues to be a fearless leader and just such a strong advocate for critical cultural programming here at UCR. And if I may, I also just wanted to provide a land acknowledgement as we start. And this land acknowledgement was collectively written by the Gender and Sexuality Studies Department here at UC Riverside. So our department recognizes the University of California as a settler land grant institution that exists on the occupied, unceded, and ancestral lands of Indigenous peoples. Our campus, UC Riverside, was built and is currently expanding upon land belonging to the Cahuilla, Tongva, and Lusaño and Serrano peoples, and all of their relatives and relations, past, present, and future. We gratefully recognize our responsibility to learn from and stand in solidarity with the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air, who also model a tradition of Indigenous resistance, community survivance, and sovereignty in the face of settler colonialism. We acknowledge Indigenous lands, rights, and peoples as a starting point for telling the truth about the histories of violence from which the university and its employees have benefited. We are committed to moving beyond the symbolism of the statement by centering Indigenous feminist knowledge and practice in our teaching, hiring, and the broader context of our engagement with the university and local communities. So thank you so much. So a few more things before we move to our guest speaker, Professor Yeboah, excuse me. I know we're all experts on Zoom now, but if possible, please do keep your Zoom mics off. You're free to use the chat, but please know that we won't be able to address any comments or questions until the Q&A. I just also want to share that Professor Yeboah's play, The Mothers, which this talk will be based on partly, is also available on Vimeo through today for the UCR community. So please do go to the CIS registration page for this event, which you'll see a link to the site. And then lastly, I'll share this towards the end as well. From about 2:15 to 3 p.m. today, we're co-facilitating a graduate student meet and greet remotely with Professor Yeboah through Zoom, and faculty members, of course, are also welcome to join this. And we'll share a Zoom link for this at the end of today's talk. So without further ado, I want to introduce Professor Nikki Yeboah, who goes by the pronouns of she and her. Professor Yeboah is an assistant professor of playwriting in the School of Drama at the University of Washington. As an artist scholar, her research brings together oral history methods and performance to create alternative records of Black life. Her research interests include oral history performance and the ethics and politics of conducting qualitative research in marginalized communities. She's been published widely, including in Theater Journal, Text and Performance Quarterly, Frontiers, Journal of Women's Studies, and the Western Journal of Communication. Her most recent performances have been staged at the Sorolla in Los Angeles, New College of Florida in Sarasota, the Hammer Theater in San Jose, the Marsh in San Francisco, Links Hall in Chicago, and the Chicago Cultural Center. Professor Yeboah is currently a board member of Story Center, which is a nonprofit organization that uses storytelling for social justice. Her workshops provide strategies for interviewing members from marginalized communities on sensitive topics, and she also offers techniques for adapting interview data to engaging stories to inspire people to take action. So I want to give the floor to Professor Yeboah.
Hi, everyone. So I want to begin by expressing my gratitude to you all for allowing me the opportunity to share my work with you. I wanted to begin by thanking Crystal Beck, who gave me the wonderful news that I'd be presenting here today. I had thought it would be in person. Unfortunately, I'm in gray Seattle and had wanted a bit of sunshine, but hopefully I will see you all in the future. And then Donatella Galella, who was who's been co-coordinating the research cluster and was really great on the logistical front as I was planning to come down. So thank you to the both of you. I really appreciate the work you put into this. And I also want to thank you all for coming, for being here and watching this presentation. So like Dr. Beck mentioned, my name is Nikki Yeboah, and I'm looking forward to sharing my research with you all. It's been many years of ruminating on this. And so it's nice to finally be at a point where I can share my work with a larger audience. So let me share my screen. All right, so this talk is entitled Everything But the Stage Toward a Feminist Oral History Praxis. And I actually want to begin by inviting all of you here to think about a question that, two questions that I'm about to pose to you. I'm actually going to put you into little breakout rooms where you'll be partnered up and invite you to ruminate with the person in your group about the following set of questions. What I have up here right now is a quote from Sarah Ahmed, a feminist scholar, and she says, "What's my feminist story? Like you, I have many." And so what I'm hoping you'll share in your groups are your feminist stories. Firstly, what does feminism mean to you? And then also, if you could share in your group the story of how you became feminist, right? So the two prompts are, what does feminism mean to you? And if you could also share the story of how you became feminist. So let me try to assign you in breakout rooms. I'm gonna assign automatically. So it'll be random. All right. And I'll give you about 5 to 6 minutes to talk amongst yourselves and think about the two questions before we come back together and I share with you my research. So feel free to join a room. We're just waiting for everyone else to return. All right, great. I think everyone is back now. Thank you for engaging in that exercise. I will share my feminist story with you today, but before I do, I wanted to know if anyone felt comfortable with sharing any of the stories that came up for them after I asked the prompt. I know it's not something we're asked often. When I thought about it, it was a strange journey myself trying to piece it all together, but I'd love to hear any snippets from the conversations you shared with your partner if you're comfortable.
So my partner was Tommy, and we didn't get to finish. There's almost never enough time to finish, right?
Yeah, sorry.
What I really appreciated about their comments were they started with their journey as a teenager and kind of was sharing a little bit more as they were growing up. And so just hearing about how things now would have impacted them then was just really powerful. So I really appreciate you sharing, Tommy.
That's awesome.
Thank you, Amanda. I just want to say that being much older, I was so impressed by Amanda's the strength, and just courage and independence that she expressed. I was genuinely very moved by her story.
That's great. Anyone else want to reflect on what that experience was like in the breakout room? All right. So if no one else wants to share, going once, going twice, I'm going to launch into the rest of the talk. So a little bit more about me. I am a performance maker and a scholar and a teacher. I'm also a Black feminist whose research adapts oral histories into community engaged performances about and for Black people, though everyone is invited along for the ride. Because of the marginalization that members of my community face, I think a lot about the ethics and politics of my process. So the first time this came up for me was in graduate school, while I was conducting research for my solo piece titled Of Small and Black Things. That performance was based on a series of oral history interviews I'd collected with my grandmother and my mother. And going into the interviews, I had read all of these celebratory articles about giving voice to the voiceless. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with articles that are just like that. And I went in there feeling really empowered and almost like I was doing them a favor, right? Our work as oral history performance makers seems clear. We push beyond the institutional voices of the oppressive systems that frame Black lives and engage underrepresented perspectives in dialogue. So when well executed, oral history performance humanizes the people behind the statistics. It deepens our knowledge of their lived experience and complicates narratives that stereotype them or engender prejudice against them. Based on that description, the work we do is inherently noble. So I couldn't understand why my mother and my grandmother kept putting me off. Didn't they want to feel seen and heard? Then at the beginning of one interview with my mother, she turned to me and asked me not to record. She was nervous about who was going to hear it, and in a voice lower than I'd ever heard it, because I was used to her mom voice, she said, "I don't want people to know it's me." There will be some things that I miss, some things that I'm not proud of. And when she said miss, she meant there will be some things that I purposely leave out, some things that she's not proud of. So my mother had lived much of her life in Canada. We emigrated when I was 6 and she was in her 30s. So we'd lived much of her life, our lives in Canada, feeling surveilled by the Canadian government, because for many years we were on government assistance, and what that meant was increased state scrutiny, right? Feelings of judgment, feelings of shame. Yes, her story was important, but not at the expense of her dignity and her hard-won sense of freedom. So I had to come up with a different way to share it, in a way that respected her need for privacy. So instead of going the verbatim theater route, which is the route that the Mothers follows, which is you take the direct quotes from the interview and you reveal who the person is that is telling the stories. And that's the most common form. You see it in Anna Devere Smith's work. The vagina monologues is one of the most popular forms of that art form. But instead of going that route, I actually ended up writing a play that was an anthropomorphic tale about a little Black bird who leaves her community in search of color. And so I told this as a folk tale to protect my mother's privacy. And I'm able to share this story with you now because after many oral histories and many conversations over the decade that's passed since that time, she's at peace with those years of her life and actually quite proud of where she's gone, how she's journeyed. But since this solo performance that I just narrated, my aesthetic practice has remained concerned with the politics of how we represent and tell stories of vulnerable people. My creative projects since then have adapted the narratives of refugees and migrants and victims of sexual violence. And the longer I do this work, the less I have found the models for traditional documentary theater making useful for tackling issues of visibility and the politics of representation. So when developing my play, The Mothers, which is an oral history performance adapted from the narratives of 4 women, Kimberly Phillips, Dion Smith Downs, Lori Valdez, and Sharon Watkins, all Bay Area women who have lost family members to police violence, I felt like I needed to go in search of new tools. New tools that did not just celebrate what I did, but empowered me to go about it ethically and critically. Before I begin, for those who haven't seen the work, I'd like to share just a little bit of an excerpt from a recent Zoom performance of The Mothers that was commissioned by the New College of Florida with support from the Mellon Foundation, just so you can better visualize what I mean. Where are you? Just a second. There we go. I'll try sharing screen again. Oh, for some reason, oh, there we go, found it. All right.
Drink or snack on. Actually, can you write into the chat what you're drinking and munching on?
Yes, let us know.
Pizza.
Pizza.
Coffee.
Coffee. Yes. Some
Lots
ginger
of
tea. That sounds so good.
Red wine.
Man, lemonade. Yes.
Everybody's having cake already. The chat throughout the performance.
Yeah. Yes. Ooh, Chipotle.
Well, are y'all ready?
Mm-hmm. Oh.
this is going to be a breeze. This is baby number 3, so you know it gets easier with each one, right? Well, with Phil, it was taking a long time, and it was hurting more than the first one hurt. And I remember knowing something's wrong. Something's wrong, and they're like,
Oh, no, no, no. Just breathe, breathe.
the last thing you need to tell a person in labor when they tell you something's wrong, don't tell them to breathe, you know? I was like, I told the nurse, I knew something was wrong. I was telling you something was wrong because this pain is not supposed to be this bad. This is baby number 3, you know? He had to come into the world like that. And he was the only one that was like that.
Well, I was in labor. I was in pain. I mean, so much pain. And so I was like, I could do this. So I drove myself all the way to the hospital. Now, I didn't know that I was going to have the baby and my car act up on the way too. I had a van jumpstart me on Highway 5. I went in there and I was like, oh, I'm sick. And they said,
oh, you finna have a baby.
I was like 9 or 8 centimeters, so the baby was basically ready. Then the nurse said, don't you have that baby yet? Don't you do it? Don't you do it? Well, you know, if it's gonna come, it's gonna come. I just pushed that baby out on the bed.
I was tired, and I guess I was losing a lot of blood, and I was getting weak. So eventually they said, we're going to have to do an emergency C-section. And they gave Antonio the scrubs he had to put on. He had to put on the net and, well, you know, everything because it's sterile. So he comes out, and when he comes out, his pants are on backwards. Everything's on the wrong way. And I'm like, oh, what are you doing? No, you have everything on wrong. Go change. I'm going into surgery, and he's over here messing around. So the doctor says you're going to feel a lot of pressure, right? Like a diesel truck has just run you over. And I'm like, just hurry up. So as they're doing that, I'm cold and stuff, right? And I'm throwing up. And I've never thrown up so much. I'm just like, whoa. Antonio's right there with the throw up tray, right? And I just keep puking up yellow bile. And he's right there, you know, rubbing my face, rubbing my head, and don't die on me, Chaparra. I need you. I love you. Don't leave me. Don't leave me. You're going to be okay.
How sweet. How sweet.
Antonio, don't talk to me right now. I don't feel good. I'm tired. So they get Josiah out so I could see him, right? And I turn to look, but I am so out of it. And I see them like taking him away. And I'm like, Antonio, go with them. Because I don't even know what our son looks like, right? I'm like, go with them. Make sure you know what our son looks like.
I had AJ Kaiser, all natural, because I said I wanted to have the baby natural. Oh, but I was banging for them drugs. And Aaron, my ex-husband, he said, don't you remember that you said you don't want no drugs? No, she doesn't want no drugs. So I did end up having him natural, but, you know, I was kind of glad because then I got to have him the way I wanted to have him, you know?
All right, so what you just heard were some of the birth stories from the women that I interviewed about the children that they lost to police violence. So I hope this better helps you envision the piece as I narrate my process. So while developing this work, I had to again revisit what I had learned about how to do oral history performance and make sure it responded to the unique needs of the community that I was representing. And I've since published 2 articles detailing the lessons that I learned along the way. The first article called I Know How It Is When Nobody Sees You. I won't get into today, but I wanted to briefly talk to you about some of the lessons that I drew from there and then transition to the bulk of my talk. What that one does is it attempts to provide some kind of guidance for oral historians doing the work of staging the difficult narratives of historically marginalized communities in the age of trauma porn. So the age of trauma porn is an age where when minoritarian bodies are given voice only to narrate their trauma for the white masses. So I argue that for contemporary storytellers, our challenge is not that these narratives are silenced. Our call is no longer just to make them visible, but rather to ask, how do we make the hyper-visible meaningful? How do we get audiences who are inundated with images and narratives of racial violence to do more than passively consume the suffering of minoritarian people? So in that paper, I offer some methodological approaches to creating oral history performance, theater that invites social intervention. So my method in that is by no means the answer, but it is an invitation for performance ethnographers to acknowledge and wrestle with the reality that in a society oversaturated with images of racial trauma, simply staging stories of minoritarian hardship is not an inherently radical act. It may in fact reproduce trauma porn and trauma, and can produce a voyeuristic relationship to the pain of those we are attempting to humanize. So as we strive to create these performances of possibility that compel audiences to empathetically travel from their subjectivity to that of an other, how are we attuned and responding to a culture of fast empathy, which is a society in which empathy is produced, consumed, and marketed to its population at rapid rates? So in that article, I articulate 3 principles to approaching the adaptation process with this in mind. The first is that I posit that theater makers should de-emphasize the singularity of the individual's experience and instead place the victim, perpetrator, and traumatic episode within the larger complex system of power and dominance in which the trauma unfolds. So what this means for playwrights is that we no longer take a character-driven approach to writing plays. And if anyone here is a writer, they know that the character is kind of like our entry point into the story. And we're trained quite heavily to focus on character development as a way of getting to the larger lesson. But characters are individuals. And what we're trying to do in social justice performance is make a connection between the trauma that people experience individually and its relationship to dominant culture. Only then can we start to see trauma as a tool of dominance and political oppression rather than the action of a few bad apples. So first, I ask that we do away with this character-driven approach. And then the second is that I ask that we question the utility of maintaining the fourth wall. If dialogue is at the core of our intentions, how can performance practitioners create a theatrical experience that encourages critical conversations, where audiences are invited to hold in tension the similarities and difference in their shared experience of community and their unique role and responsibility in co-creating the conditions that make such trauma possible. If you remember the beginning of the clip that I showed you, they're talking directly to the audience initially. And I really struggled to figure out how to recreate this on Zoom. In the Zoom version, the chats were open and people were talking throughout. In real time, I don't know how to put it, in real life, off screen, there are a lot of prompts for the audience to engage. We ask them questions to which they respond. We invite them to talk to each other and with the performers. There's a dance routine. When the play actually starts, they're at the birthday party and each audience member brings in something to the party. So like we build this community together. And again, this is my attempt to break the fourth wall so that the consumption of this is not passive, but rather an active engagement and investment in the people that they will get to know over the course of the hour of the performance. The last thing I do is I ask us to reimagine the end of the play as the beginning of a much greater social drama, where change can be, must be, and is already being enacted. So the final principle insists that we refuse catharsis. So what I'm saying is that if utopia is what we wish to create in the world, we have to try to deny our audience a realization of utopia on stage. So the idea behind this tactic is that by leaving audience members feeling unfulfilled by how the play ends, they may be motivated to take action in their everyday lives to settle their longing for a more just world. So if the audience leaves feeling restless, hopefully they do something about that. But if the audience feels resolved at the end, then they're again invited to go back out into the community and kind of passively, engage with it because it's been resolved. So those are the three principles that respond to the question of what our responsibility is as scholars, activists, and artists invested in the work of oral history performance in the age of trauma culture. And in the Q&A, I can talk about it further, but what I want to focus on today is Everything But the Stage, Toward a Feminist Theatrical Praxis, which was published in Frontiers, a journal of women's study, about a year ago. Because this article marks the beginning of my attempt to name what my creative practice has been thus far. My creative practice strives to make feminist works. I want the performances I stage to be a part of the ongoing project to create the Black feminist futures that I want to be a part of. So according to Black feminist theorist Tina Kempt, Black feminist futurity is not about looking toward the future, but about the quotidian performances that realize the time to come in the present moment. She writes, and I quote, "The grammar of Black feminist futurity is a performance of a future that hasn't yet happened, but must. It is an attachment to a belief in what should be true, which impels us to realize that aspiration. It is the power to imagine beyond current fact and to envision that which is not, but must be. A striving for the future you want to see right now in the present," end quote. So Kempt describes Black feminist futurity as deeply invested in the politics of the now. It doesn't hopefully wait for change to come, but rather it is compelled to imagine and enact some version of it in the present. It is what must be. If I want change, I can't just wait for it. I must look for possibilities to make it happen now. Kempt's research explores the daily labor that is necessary if we are to actualize a feminism not yet realized. For her, feminism is a process and it occurs in little everyday actions. Around this time, I also started reading Sarah Ahmed's Living a Feminist Life. And she's also engaged with the quotidian as a site for the everyday acts of refusal that make up our individual feminist journeys. The quote earlier about our feminist stories comes from that book. And for those who haven't read it, I strongly urge you to do so. It doesn't read like an academic text. In fact, I wish I'd read it when I was a teenager. It's written like a conversation with a feminist auntie that you always wanted. She gently warns you of all the difficulties you may encounter as you walk this path. And she poignantly reflects on her journey to becoming her feminist self, encounters with families and friends where she becomes a killjoy, pointing out the sexism and racism in so-called jokes, for example, the refusing to smile to make others comfortable, refusing to recede into the background so as not to threaten the status quo, refusing to travel the well-trodden path of normativity, and so many other examples. The beauty of her book, for me, lies in her articulation of feminism as a state of becoming, not just a point of arrival. So this shift from the articulation of feminism as a quotidian process and not just identity was a light bulb moment for me. According to Ahmed, reflecting on the process by which we construct a feminist identity is important because, quote, "If we start with our experiences of becoming feminists, we might generate new ideas about feminism," end quote. So for Ahmed, these experiences become the foundation upon which we imagine and construct our feminist futures. So I decided to apply Ahmed's ideas not only to my feminist self, but to my feminist works. So The Mothers is a play about women of color, written, directed, produced, and performed by women of color. It's undoubtedly a feminist work, right? But what new ideas about feminism might we conjure if we consider the process by which feminist theater is created, rather than by focusing our attention solely on the content of the piece, the gender identity of its creators, or whether it's past the Bechdel standard of representation. And for those of you who don't know what Bechdel is, it's when two women are in a creative work and they're not talking about men. If that happens, then repeatedly, then the work is feminist. All of these remain useful metrics, and my goal here is not to argue that we move away from issues of gender representation, but rather my hope is that we can open ourselves up to new possibilities for what feminism might look like during the creative process itself. So in this talk, I seek to expand our ideas of feminist theater from identity-based and content-driven critiques to one that asks, how might our artistic processes materialize our politics, beliefs, and identities? For feminist theater makers, the quotidian is all the stuff we do in the dark and unexposed to the glaring lights, the stuff that happens behind the curtains and beyond the stage. It is the conversations we have about casting, the rehearsal process, the theaters we partner with, the funds we source, and so on. It is my belief that these unremarkable moments contain radical potential for realizing our visions of our feminist futures. I place Camp's Grammar of Black Futurity and Ahmed's exploration of the process of becoming feminist in conversation to advocate a shift of our gaze as feminist theater critics and creatives to the often overlooked and mundane aspects of theater making. If, as both theorists argue, the quotidian is a crucial site for the enactment of feminist futurities, then how does diverting our attention from the spectacle of the theatrical event itself and attending to the more peripheral actions that go into its staging reveal ways to mobilize the quotidian as a critical site of refusal? After all, it is these seemingly banal moments where we come up against the patriarchal and neoliberal structures that attempt to rob us of our futures. So why not think about how to mobilize them for our own political objectives? In this vein, in today's talk, I explore how feminist theater makers might do theater differently if we want the process and not only the product to be a feminist one. So to do this, I reflect on my own creative journey of staging the mothers, on the tactical decisions that were made or that I missed along the way that sought to embed Black feminist politics into the creative process itself. I seek to expand our ideas of feminist theater from identity-based and content-driven to one that asks, how might our artistic processes materialize, again, our politics, beliefs, and identities? My research is fueled by a desire to create an artistic practice that speaks to my Black feminist politics. It's an invitation to mobilize theater as a daily rehearsal for our collective futures. I begin with a rumination on taking a sensorial approach to theater making, one that deeply listens and responds to our feminist feelings and the voices of the community as we develop the project. I then take up the notion of using the theater talkback as a site of feminist resistance. And lastly, I consider how to build in ethics of care in the rehearsal process that acknowledge the cost of telling difficult stories on our interlocutors, our performers, and ourselves. For the sake of time, I will spend the bulk of the talk on the first point and only briefly address the talkback and practices of self-care, but I would be happy to flesh it out more fully in the Q&A. Allow me to share my screen once more. I Googled his name first. Nothing came up, so I tried again. Aaron James Phillips, San Jose Police. And I clicked on the first link, or at least it was the first link at the time. Now it's buried on the second page, a few links down. Oh, it's buried even further now. As the years pass, it becomes harder and harder to find. But it was a press release from the San Jose Police Department, case number 15-222-0008, suspect number 1, Phillips Aaron James, age 30. Below that information were the names of officers and their years of experience on the force. Officer Bergstrom had served 9 years at the time, but Officer Morin was a newbie with just 2.5. There was an image of Aaron's face beside a picture of a shotgun. You can see him here. It looked like a mugshot. He was somber, unsmiling, vacant, I don't know, resigned. He stared at you with the air of someone used to taking pictures like these, beside weapons, like the one that was in the press release. He looked like a criminal. The report said his sister had called the police scared because her brother was outside with a shotgun threatening to kill himself. When the police arrived at 12:16 a.m., he brandished a shotgun at officers only to disappear inside the house when the officers shot back. Quote, moments later, a single gunshot was heard inside the residence. At approximately 6:17 a.m., officers located the deceased suspect inside the residence with a self-inflicted gunshot wound, end quote. The officers were now on paid leave pending investigations. Wait, I thought. So AJ shot himself around midnight, but nobody went inside to locate his body until after 6 a.m.? 6 hours later? That didn't make any sense. I reread the report, then reread it again. Something felt off, but what did I know about police investigations? Moving on to the story of Philip Watkins, when his mother-in-law, saw how distraught he was. His mother-in-law, Faye Buchanan, called the suicide prevention line. She invited Philip into her home and together they waited. Unfortunately, the police arrived before the mental health professionals could. Philip had a knife, and as he came toward them, they shot him point blank. The mother-in-law is quoted as saying, "I'm screaming, begging, telling you he needs help. Please help him, don't shoot," end quote, but they shot anyway. Reading these words, I felt my heart in my chest, like literally felt the full weight of it pressing against me. I had never noticed the weight of my heart before. Closing my laptop, I put my hand to my chest to massage it gently, willing the sensation to dissipate. Buchanan had told them that she didn't fear for her life. She had asked for help and they had responded with bullets. What did the police say happened that day? I asked Lori Valdez, the partner of Antonio Guzman Lopez, who was shot by San Jose University police on February 21st, 2014. And she responds, so they said that they got a phone call about a man walking through campus with a knife and he was acting weird. Antonio had a saw blade, which is to cut sheetrock, right? There's a lot of construction workers carrying those types of tools on campus. So to me, I was like, why was he singled out? Antonio wasn't even on campus when they killed him. He was off campus in city jurisdiction. So why did the university police come out and kill him? The guy who made the call called, but he said he wasn't afraid of him. He was just concerned. He had not committed a crime. He wasn't on probation. So why did they come at him with guns, right? Many of the witnesses who are girls said he was acting a little bit strange, but they didn't feel like he was a danger to anybody. So my question is, nobody felt threatened. Why is he dead? Why is he dead? Lori Valdez sensed something was off. She felt it in her gut. I felt it in my chest. This feeling that the story did not quite add up, that the violence could not quite be understood. Why, if X happened, was Y the result? Why, if nobody felt threatened, did they advance with guns? Why, if people were screaming that he needed help, would they respond with the hail of bullets? Why would they hear the sound of a single bullet inside a home at midnight, but not enter the home until 6 in the morning? Why? I couldn't shake my feelings of discomfort. These were the feelings that first prompted me to collect their stories. Feminist feelings. In Living a Feminist Life, Sarah Ahmed writes that feminism begins with a sensation. This sensation, she argues, is the sensible, if not intentional, response to an unjust world. It is a felt sense knowledge that all is not well. When we lean into these sensations, it awakens in us feminist desire. She says, quote, over time with experience, you sense that something is wrong or you have a feeling of being wronged. You sense an injustice. You might not have used that word for it. You might not have the words for it. You might not be able to put your finger on it. Feminism can begin with a body in touch with the world, a body that is not at ease, end quote. According to Ahmed, the unease I felt upon reading these stories was an awakening into a feminist sensibility, a slight but persistent discomfort that could not be articulated but would not dissipate. So long had it persisted that I could no longer identify the source. What I knew was that it followed me to work. It was with me as I rode the train home. It rested beside me in bed. It grew in intensity with every murder, every unanswered question. Every time my body made contact with an anti-Black world, the sensation would flare up. For my non-Black, non-female identifying students unsure of how to approach a Black feminist aesthetic, I tell them this is where you start. A deep attunement to sensations of discomfort about injustice in our world. The mother was born out of an accumulation of such sensations. A relentless assault on the senses that compelled me to listen with a level of intensity that required focused attention, or what performance ethnographer Disoyini Madison terms deep listening. Listening with the ears alone allows you to hear what is spoken. But according to Tina Compt, for those who live on the margins, the wealth of their experiences are not limited to what can be spoken about. It is an attunement to how we listen and what we listen for. Black lives are lived in the lower frequencies, affective zones of contact beyond the state's framing gaze. To find those frequencies, we must listen for the quiet sounds muffled deep beneath the pernicious white noise of the state. So how did I mobilize feminist strategies of deep listening in my oral history process? Firstly, I had to create a safe space where they felt safe to speak. I let them interview me first. I learned this lesson the hard way by repeating the same mistake as I did a decade ago with my mother by assuming that these women were seeking a microphone to amplify their voice. They are not. That is a white liberal conceit. They want ownership of their stories. They want to trust the person they share it with. So after one mother rejected me outright because I was unprepared to answer the questions she asked in our introductory phone call, I built the reverse interview into my process. The reverse interview, where they interview me first, builds trust and community through storytelling. Deep listening also requires an attunement not only to the words that are being spoken, but how they are spoken. Like the moment when Sharon Watkins recollects an old hoodie her son Philip used to wear. And while remembering its warmth, she pulls her cardigan gently closed around her. Listening for content helps the interviewer prepare follow-up questions, but listening to the body signals whether or not you should ask that question at all. For example, in the first half of our interview, Sharon sat across the table from me, arms crossed and head turned in my general direction, but not directly toward me. As I listened to how her body spoke, I adapted my questions accordingly. I did not mention her son's death until after I saw her eyes connect with mine and stay there. Deep listening is constituted by moments of contact, both oral and physical, the hold of a gaze, the touch of a hand, a hug, a shared moment of silence and grief. Deep listening means allowing for repetition, confusion, and disorder to appear in the narratives. It allows for people to make sense of their stories in the process of telling them. Dion told the story of her teenage son, James Rivera Jr., his death about 4 different times to me in the interview that we had. Each telling of it was fragmented and unclear. I couldn't make sense of it. Many times I had to bite my tongue to prevent myself from asking her to clarify her statements. But by the end of the interview, I knew she had never been told what happened that day. The police had sealed those records. She had been made to piece it together by herself. The story was told to me by Dion in the way it was received by her. I teach deep listening strategies in the classroom as well. I teach my students to arrive with a notepad and a recorder, but to let the recorder do the job of recording what is uttered, and their notes linger on the textures of their voices, the gestures of their bodies, the expressions on their faces. Deep listening also comes with a responsibility to respond to what you are told. I often ask my students, what's in it for the people that you are interviewing? Because for my students, it's clear, you're getting credit for a course, right? But how will you give back? How do we make this relationship reciprocal and not extractive? Anthropology has too long had an exploitative relationship to its native others. We don't want to continue to contribute to that. After the Mothers premiered in San Jose over Mother's Day weekend in 2018, I felt like my mission was accomplished. I had returned to the stories to the communities from whence they came. I felt great about myself. It was only ever meant to be a community project for us to reflect on what was happening in our corner of the world. However, for my interview subjects, my work had just begun. Quote, "Hi, Nikki, hope you're well. Would love to hear about the plans for mothers and if there's any support you need. I'm also curious about whether it could be possible to do a showing before the State Assembly in Sacramento and invite the State Assembly before the upcoming vote. Has there been any discussion of this?" End quote. The mothers I had interviewed for the project wanted to take the play to the Senate ahead of their vote on Assembly Bill 931, which would change how police were permitted to use deadly force. The mothers, alongside organizers from across California, were planning a public action in Sacramento in the days leading up to the vote, and they saw my play as an opportunity to put a human face to their stories. So I got to work. The logistical reality was that I had 3 weeks to raise money, find performers, a crew, and a venue to stage the work. Theatrical norms had to give way to political efficacy. The stage reading shifted from being a stepping stone to a larger production, and instead the stage reading became the production itself. My approach now was to create a work that was easily mountable, that required minimal rehearsal time, minimal props, minimal moving parts. That is what responsive theater making is. An audience member once asked where I saw the mothers going in the future. And while I can't recall how I responded, I do remember that there were images floating around in my head of shanghaes for colored girls who have considered suicide when the rainbow is enough. So a poetic melding together of powerful narratives, choreographed movement, color and sound, richly layered in conversation with one another. This is where my creative mind went when I allowed myself to dream big. But embracing a process responding to the needs of the community resulted in a much simpler aesthetic that would be of service to them. So on August 5th, 2018, 4 young women of color walked on stage and took their place behind 4 music stands. Atop each stand was a script, behind them a projector, and that was it. The minimalist aesthetic reflected the needs of the community that it served. I want to close by talking a bit about the other 2 points I was unable to cover, namely the talkback and strategies of care. So in theater, the talkback is a thing that happens after the audience applauds, right? The lights dim and the curtains are drawn. It's an opportunity for audience members to discuss their experience of the show with those involved in its creation. The talkback offers an opportunity for audiences to know more about the process and think through themes and ideas. And traditionally, the playwright, director, actors are invited on stage for a conversation. And while useful, theatergoers actually find it bothersome quite often and unnecessary, and is rarely considered a critical part of their production. Outside theater, though, to talk back means to answer defiantly back at a person, to answer defiantly back at a people or a system with which you disagree. So how many of us have ever been accused of talking back at one point in our lives, have been put in our place for daring to challenge the opinion of someone of authority? How many of us have not actually intended to talk back, but just wanted to give voice to our experience, correct a misunderstanding, or offer our perspective? The notion of talking back is inextricably linked to power. An argument between two equals where one person expresses their disagreement is rarely categorized as talking back. That label is reserved almost exclusively to describe an exchange between two individuals where one of them holds more power as a result of their gender, race, sexuality, age, etc. And the person who launches the accusation is rarely the person who holds the least power. It's rarely the child that hurls these words at their parents, right? Rarely the slave that points an accusing finger at their master. As theorists of performance and gender know, words do things, and what it does can be more powerful than what is uttered. So for the marginalized, merely the act of speaking without first having sought permission is a challenge to authority. It marks you as dangerous, willful, and nasty woman. If you cannot hold your tongue in the presence of power, you are talking back. For feminists, talking back is a way of life. Evoking the figure of the feminist killjoy, which Sarah Ahmed so eloquently describes, quote, "The one who speaks as a feminist is usually heard as the cause of the argument. She stops the smooth flow of communication. It becomes tense. She makes things tense. She's getting in the way of something, the achievement or accomplishment of the family or of some we or another, which is created by what is not said. So much you are supposed to not say, to do, to be, in order to preserve that we," end quote. In my work, I reimagine the theater talkback as a critical space to invoke the feminist killjoy. For the mothers, I use the talkback to create possibilities for the public to respond to an oppressive system. The talkbacks have been used for three main purposes: to strategize around specific actions, to bring the community together, to talk about the impact of police violence in their own lives, and to allow the mothers the opportunity to witness and know that they do not fight alone. And then lastly, I want to briefly mention strategies of care, which began when one of the mothers, Dion, ended up in the hospital due to heart issues. And I read an article talking about the number of activists that actually die from health complications linked to the stress of what they do. And then also became really attuned to the ways in which I too had kind of started to crumple under the weight of holding these stories. And then I also heard that my actors were in tears during rehearsal. And I realized that I needed to create an ethic of care in my own work, which was something I was unprepared to do because I'd never done self-care on my own even. So to think about putting it in my artistic practice, it's the least developed of the feminist practices that I talk about because it is what I need most work on. And I also invite conversation from others as to how to develop it further. Some of the ideas that I've thought about is to embrace slowness more. I have done this, which is I pay interviewees for their time. And I'm trying to create more resources for people to feel emotionally and psychologically supported. So yeah, with that, I will end there. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Professor Yeboah. That was such a beautiful and rigorous talk. We just really appreciate you sharing your work with us. So I actually want to shift into Q&A. So let's see, you can either raise your hand and Donna and I will co-facilitate together, or you can also feel free to share in the chat, and I would be more than happy to share that question with the audience. So please don't be shy. This is a really wonderful opportunity to engage with Professor Yeboah, but really sort of collectively in this space. So there's a question. Ali, did you want me to, Ali's one of my students, did you want me to read this out loud, or did you want to unmute yourself?
I can save you some voice, Crystal, that's fine. Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Yeboah. This has been wonderful. I've been taking so many notes, and I just appreciate you taking your time to be here. I was hoping to hear you speak a little bit more about that talkback process that you, signaled that there's so much more to talk about there. I'm especially really interested in how that might intersect with the paradigm that you talked about earlier of like giving voice, voiceless, and how maybe the talkback process, pardon the pun, speaks to that.
Yeah, so one of the other stories that informed this talkback was, and I go into it more in the article, I believe, is that one of the mothers, Sharon, sent an email to the president of my university at the time, San Jose State University, which is where one of the people that were murdered, they were murdered on my campus, my former campus. And the president of the university has started to create a bunch of like programs where police officers could come into the school and like hang out with football players, and they're predominantly of color. And she kept sending these notices out like, yeah, we do need a community conversation, come meet the police. And I remember I would get these emails and I would just roll my eyes like, this woman is so out of touch. But Sharon actually emailed her and said, listen, what you're writing can be triggering. Why wouldn't you create another space for those that have harder hitting questions for them? Or create spaces for people like myself who have been victimized by the police. And instead, all you're doing is providing a platform for the police, right? To look good. And Sharon, if you know her, she was like one of the most reluctant to talk to me. She's quite soft-spoken. And when she sent this email and then she CC'd me, and even in the email, she was like, and also, I don't know if you know this, but a member of your, like one of your professors has written this play. Here's a link to the website, And I was like, wow, this woman is, while I was silently grumbling, she was talking back, right? And so in terms of the voice and the voiceless, it made me think about the fact that, everyone has a voice, it's just who is listening and who's providing platforms. They had been in their community talking and engaging these issues for decades. And so it was just a matter of like not giving them a voice because they have a strong one, but allowing others to access that voice. And I felt like the talkback allowed them to do that. It also allowed them to frame, themselves, their stories, and what they wanted from us, because while the play is verbatim, it's still me that crafts it. I wanted to provide them with an opportunity to craft whatever narrative that they wanted to craft around it. I wanted to give them a chance to mobilize however they wanted to mobilize. I wanted the audience to see these people as like people, not characters. So for me, that was what the talkback was serving, the function it was serving. And so I've never staged the play without at least one of them present to do that. I always make sure that they are there, they are heard, and that they're paid for their time as well. Adriana wants to know what was the most challenging part of making the play. I'll say that, and this speaks to my last point about self-care. While I was writing this work, I actually, it was, how do I put this? It was really difficult for me, but I was the last to know just how difficult it was for me. So I had insomnia. I became, easily irritable. I became afraid of the police. I was a nightmare to be around. This lasted for like a year, and I couldn't name it until a year later when I reflected back and realized, oh, the stories were triggering me, and they were hard for me to absorb. But it took me a year to arrive at that conclusion. And in that time, if I hadn't figured out that I needed self-care, no one else in the process was getting self-care through me. And so that was the most challenging part, but you know, I didn't want it to be the most challenging part. I felt like it would be selfish for me to like lean into my feelings when these women had suffered as much as they had. I wanted to be kind of, you know, I don't know, like a safe place for them to share their stories. And I didn't want to take up space that I felt was theirs. And so wrestling with like what you need alongside their needs for me was the most challenging. And it's kind of ongoing.
Anusha, did you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Crystal, for organizing this. And thank you, Professor Yeboah. That was wonderful. I've also been furiously taking notes and really enjoying listening to you talk through the process-oriented aspects and thinking about the feminist process versus a feminist product was really helpful. And also, I'd love to hear more about the reverse interview. I love that idea, but my question actually is about, I'm in the dance department, and I'm wondering if you had any advice for how to do a feminist oral history performance praxis in relation to folks that I might not agree with politically, who might not share the same social justice goals and aims and values, when our politics are not aligned and not even just not being aligned, but maybe go against social justice norms. How do you continue? I find often with, you know, scholarship like, you know, Madison and Congregate and all of those folks, like it's really easy when the people that you're researching, they're so, you know, are aligned with that kind of larger social justice goal. But how do you do that in relation to people that you're interviewing or researching where that's not the case? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that if you had any, and also the reverse interview if you have time to talk about that too. Thank you so much again.
Yeah, no problem. Madison has this article as part of the title. I think it says like crack the mirror or something like that. Crack the mirror. Anyways, I'll tell you what the article is about. It's about a student who performed a piece where she did an oral history with her grandmother, who grew up racist and remains racist. And the grandmother, you know, said all of these racist things in the interview, and then the student showed up and then performed it like verbatim. And in the moment, everyone around, because she was such a virtuosic performer, all the other students were like, wow, that was like, we really got, you know, a slice of the life of a racist, and thank you for sharing that with me and with us. And it didn't sit with her well, Madison. Like that event unfolded, but she continued to think about it because she felt like she could have done something. So she writes this article that basically argues against the artist being a window to the world or a mirror to the world, and invites artists to crack the mirror, right? And by this, she means, especially with you as a dancer, there are the words that this person says, and then there are what your body is doing. And your body can express your politics, even as the words express something else. What can you do to crack the mirror that you are projecting back to the world if you don't feel ethical in just reproducing it? You know, there are some things you don't want to reproduce. And so in that article, Madison invites you to crack the mirror as opposed to be the mirror. And so thinking about ways in which through dance, you can critically reflect the world back to itself, even while using that source material is one way of doing that. And then I feel like there is another one. Is it Kathy Blee? Is that the right? There's an oral historian who did work with, I'm so horrible with names, I apologize. Who did work with women that were part of the white supremacist movement. And she hangs out with them for a while and shares their stories. And they're all very like, and we fundraise and we babysit each other's children. And it's like this beautiful kind of idyllic town. And in that article, she also wrestles with, you know, at the end of the day, they're white supremacists, you know, but she felt like she was reproducing this narrative of like, they're just normal people, just like us. So I would invite you to read that as well and see how she frames it, or kind of tries to think critically about it. Because I think she does let the words, yeah, thank you. Donatella's just put that in the chat. She does kind of agonize about it because I think she chooses to be a mirror, but she frames maybe the intro and the conclusion in her voice. But the bulk of it, the bulk of the content is her acting as a mirror to their voices. So that's another strategy that was taken. When I started when I decided I wanted to do the mothers, the original idea was to interview both police officers and the mothers, and to have that be a conversation that unfolds on stage. It made me feel really icky, but I was like, you know, for the sake of democracy and, you know, everybody should have a voice, etc. And there were a number of people that told me, you know, you don't have to be that voice. You know, that doesn't have to be you. You don't have to be everything to everybody. Be what feels right to you. So that's a third point that I want to put out there for you to maybe reflect on as well. The reverse talkback is just me meeting up with them for a coffee or tea or whatever before the formal interview, and they get to ask me anything they want to ask me. Quite often these women feel like their stories are being appropriated. They feel like people come, they steal their stories and then to become famous in their own right, or to get some money from it or whatever. And then they never see these people again. These people are not invested in the cause and they feel used. And it's very traumatic for them to keep sharing this story. So they were very skeptical of me at first. And so once I started these reverse interviews where we just met up and they came with like a list of questions where they could be like, what do you want to do with our stories? How did you find out about me? Why do you care? You know, these kinds of things. They were able to gauge by my response how invested I was in them. And then from there, they could come to their own decisions as to whether or not to be a part of my process.
Thank you so much, Anusha, for those great questions. So I just want to flag, I know some students may have to go around 1:50, so that's okay. I just want to read a question that Tomia shared in the chat. And Tomia, did you want me, I can just read it out loud if you want. So you shared, I was very taken by your decision to deny catharsis in your production. How does that align with recognizing the need to act out our futures and to use art as a way to perform what we believe is possible?
Yeah, so as a performance studies scholar, we also believe that performance happens off stage. And that in fact, the two things are not bound and separate or distinct, rather they speak to each other. So what you see on stage informs how you act in life. What you act in life is then represented on stage, etc. in this kind of loop. And once you start seeing performance like that, you realize that the curtains don't go down at the end of your performance, right? Like the end of your play is not the end of your play. It just can never be. And with that in mind, you think more critically about how you want people to continue to perform in life. And what I noticed is that there were some plays where at the end of it, and they would be on like issues related to social justice. And at the end of it, you would feel kind of like all is right in the world, you know, like we resolved that, like, thank God that's over. One of the plays that you might recognize is the Laramie Project, which is a story of Matthew Shepard, who was gay in, oh my gosh, in a small town in the United States. Oh, I can't remember where it was, but in the 90s, he was killed by people in that town. He met two men at a bar. He thought he was going for a hookup, and then they killed him and then tied his body to like a fence. And this theater, Tectonic Theater out of New York, hears about this story, travels to that town, Laramie, and interviews everybody in that town, from the homophobes to his friend, like the preacher, the person next door, people that were at the bar, etc. And provides a really like rich and beautiful kind of portrayal of this town in this moment, and how it's continued to unsettle the town after. At the end, however, it ends in this like idyllic way where you're at the fence where he was killed, but you're looking out at the stars, and Laramie's a beautiful town. And I think, if I remember correctly, it ends with like a reflection on the beauty of that town. And that's how it ends. And it's kind of calming, you know, like it's kind of like you have been unsettled throughout, but this ending kind of makes you feel like, yeah, and at the end of the day, people do go on. People move on with their lives and we are whole again. And it felt to me like such a waste of potential in a way, you know, like I should, if you want change, walk out and want to flip tables, you know, like I should be like, what the hell kind of system, blah, blah, and what can I do about it? But in the end, I felt like that was a dark chapter in that town's life, and I'm glad that's over and we can move on. And so that's what's behind me wanting to deny catharsis, is the knowledge that, and we've all been to performances that continue to sit with you after, or we've all seen a film that continues to sit with you after, and they inform how you act in real life. And so to deny catharsis, for me, I think provides a pathway of possibility for change to happen in our performances off stage.
Thank you, Tomia, for that really thoughtful question. Other questions or queries? And I want to thank Donatella for sharing in chat all of these different resources. It's just really, really helpful. Thank you, Donatella. Any other questions or comments? Well, I just also shared in the chat, we have, we want to provide Professor Yeboah with just a brief time to, you know, eat something and grab some tea or water, but we'll have a meet and greet, graduate student meet and greet with Professor Yeboah. And this is really for graduate students, of course, faculty members and anyone else, you're also welcome to join, but this is an opportunity to have a deeper conversation with Professor Yeboah. And to also share your work, graduate students, and really engage with Professor Yeboah that way as well. So if there are no other questions, I want to sincerely thank Professor Yeboah for joining us and for sharing your amazing work. And it's just such a moment to also be sharing this work in such an important moment. So we're really, really grateful that you spent time with us this afternoon. And again, thank you to Professor Galala, Center for Ideas in Society, for supporting this event. And please feel free to join us at 2:15 as well.
Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day, those that I don't see later.
All right. Bye, everyone.